Ever since Japanese troops had overrun Manchuria in 1931 and turned it into the puppet state of Manchu Kuo, there had been concern in the West over Japanese expansionism. This had increased in 1937, when the Japanese launched an all-out assault on China. But the Western powers were not prepared to risk war with Japan. This was even though Western warships like the American gunboat Panay were bombed by Japanese aircraft. Yet Japan did apologize for this act. She did so because she had a major weakness, which the West threatened to exploit. This was a grave lack of natural resources. Japan was heavily reliant on imports of tin, oil, rubber, and other essential raw materials. She therefore dare not provoke the West too much. In the meantime, the Chinese struggle against Japan did have Western moral support. Their leader, Chiang Kai-shek, also began to receive American loans to enable him to purchase modern weapons and equipment. These were delivered via a road that had been recently opened through the mountains separating Burma from China. It became known as the Burma Road. In July 1940, a new and more militant government took over in Japan. This looked to making the country economically independent of the West by carving out an empire in Southeast Asia through removing the British, French, Dutch, and American presence from the mineral-rich territories there. This plan was called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In order to counterbalance British and American opposition to her policies, Japan signed a tripartite pact with Germany and Italy in September 1940. Later, in April 1941, the Japanese removed the Russian threat to the north by signing a 5-year non-aggression pact in Moscow. The Japanese now turned south to French Indochina, demanding and gaining military bases in the north from a weak Vichy government. A clash between the French and neighboring Thailand in early 1941 enabled the Japanese to act as mediators, thereby increasing their influence. The French were now powerless to resist further demands, and in July 1941, the Japanese occupied the whole of French Indochina. The reaction of the Western democracies was to freeze all Japanese assets, which cut off 90% of Japanese imports at a stroke. This forced the Japanese to adopt a more conciliatory attitude, especially towards the Americans. In the meantime, the fighting in China dragged on. Chiang Kai-shek, however, received a boost when the Lend-Lease Act was introduced in America in March 1941, giving him priority next below Britain for the receipt of US munitions. One of the subsequent results of this was the dispatch to China of 100 P-40 fighters, with volunteer pilots to fly them. Led by former US Army aviator Claire Chennault, who had been helping to train the Chinese Air Force, they began to make an impression in the skies over China from the late summer of 1941, and became known as the Flying Tigers. Japanese Premier Prince Fumimaro Konoye hoped that he could achieve an understanding with the United States. But American insistence on total Japanese evacuation from China was an obstacle that could not be surmounted. Consequently, in October 1941, Prince Konoye resigned, and was succeeded by General Hideki Tojo, a leading hawk. He was determined that Japan must become self-sufficient in raw materials. He was prepared to withdraw from Indochina and parts of China, but only if the United States lifted its trade embargo and helped Japan acquire the oil, coal and rubber-rich Dutch East Indies. This was unacceptable to the Americans, who again demanded that Japan withdraw totally from China. By now, though, Tojo had decided that war was probably the only answer. Plans for it had already been laid, and Japan was poised to take a path which had earlier been spelt out by the Chinese ambassador to the United States.
Let us hope that this threat of a complete economic blockade may be sufficient to bring Japan to her senses before she plunges further in the direction of a national harakiri or national suicide.
The architect of the Japanese attack plan was Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Navy. He recognized that America's overwhelming material strength would be the deciding factor in a protracted war. Consequently, the Japanese must quickly gain all their objectives. Yamamoto considered the U.S. Pacific Fleet as the main obstacle. It must therefore be destroyed at the outset. The question was how. The clue, he believed, lay in the highly successful British carrier-borne aircraft attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto in November 1940. If the Japanese carrier force could get within range of the Pacific Fleet base at Pearl Harbor without being detected, it could launch a similar strike. This is what the Japanese Navy began to train for. The attack on Pearl Harbor was to be accompanied by others on the American Pacific islands of Wake and Guam, the British colony of Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Dutch East Indies, Solomon Islands, and Burma. The Americans believed that the Philippines were likely to be the main Japanese target. Consequently, with the agreement of the Filipino government, former U.S. Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur, who had recently been advisor to the Filipino Armed Forces, was appointed to command the defense of the Philippines. U.S. aircraft were also sent there. The British, too, had reinforced their small garrison in Hong Kong. They sent Indian and Canadian troops. But should Japanese forces cross into Hong Kong from China, the colony's remoteness precluded additional speedy reinforcement. Further troops, including Australians, had been sent to Malaya. Air reinforcement included these Lend-Lease Brewster Buffalo fighters. 2 British capital ships were ordered to Singapore, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. Yet among both Americans and British, there was a dangerous complacency born of an underestimation of Japanese military prowess. They considered that Japanese weaponry was inferior, and that their pilots, in particular, lacked skill. A large espionage network was another Japanese strength. A further factor ignored by the West was the banzai culture with which Japanese soldiers, sailors and airmen were imbued. The highest honor that they could gain was to be killed in battle for the emperor. Surrender was considered a disgrace. On the 26th of November 1941, the Japanese fleet, including 6 carriers, set sail for Pearl Harbor. This was on the same day that America issued her latest demand for Japanese withdrawal from China. The fleet sailed under strict radio silence, which meant that while the Americans knew that it was at sea, they had no idea of its destination. As the ships steamed ever closer to their target, the Japanese envoys in Washington continued to negotiate.